Welcome to Business Legal Lifecycle TV, the live TV show all about the legal aspects of your business to help educate you on complex legal terms in an easy to understand manner, to help understand why you need to do certain things in your business from a legal point of view, and to help you develop a plan for the future. Our mission at Business Legal Lifecycle is to help empower all small to medium-sized businesses around the world to get access to legal advice so that they can help build their communities and make the world a better place.
Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Business Legal Lifecycle TV. Today is our education show, and we're talking about phase 7 of the Business Legal Lifecycle, which is about expansion, franchising, and licensing. I am Craig Mason. I have with me the founder and author of the book, Business Legal Lifecycle, Jeremy Stratton. Say hello to everyone, please, Jeremy.
Hello, everyone. Hope you're having a great Wednesday.
Excellent. So as I said, today we're talking about expansion and specifically about when and how you can actually expand your business. So Jeremy, do you want to explain to our listeners or viewers a bit more about phase 7 expansion?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. So phase 7, and for those watching the video on YouTube, I've put up a copy of the Business Legal Lifecycle, the 13 phases. If you're listening to the podcast, as always, go to businesslegallifecycle.com and you'll be able to see more about that, about what it looks like, and or jump over to YouTube, type in Business Legal Lifecycle, and this is show 147, and you'll be able to see the life cycle and the video with our slides that we put up every week. So. As far as phase 7 goes, so obviously, if you're looking at the image, you'll see that phase 7 is basically on the upward trend of the business legal life cycle. So the first 6 phases are all about, the first 3 phases are about consolidation and startup, and the 4 through 6 is all about consolidating your business to get it right and ready to actually get to this phase, which is expansion. Now, one thing to note is that you don't have to expand your business. I think that's something that a lot of people miss, is they think that they need to expand their business, and you don't need to. So if you don't want to, you don't have to expand your business. However, if you do want to, then this is the phase to do it. And really the first 6 phases are all about getting the bits and pieces of your business from a legal perspective in place before you get to this phase. So if you think you want to expand, make sure that you go back and look at the previous 6 phases of your business to make sure that you really have everything set up properly, because what we're going to talk about today really is pointless if you're not set up correctly. So Craig, before we move into the what is expansion, did you want to add anything else onto phase 7?
No, I don't think so, other than, it's a very important phase, and it's not something that you're going to rush into. You need to have considered all the other things along the way, make sure they're all in place before you take the plunge into expansion. So let's kick into the rest of the today's education show.
Great. Okay.
Excellent. All right. So we're talking about expansion, obviously, and what exactly is expansion. So in the context we're talking about it is when you're expanding your business, and that could be through a variety of different ways. Could be internally by bringing on employees, buying extra equipment, those sorts of things, expanding into a totally different new market, buying another business, those sorts of options. So it's very important to consider a number of things during this phase. And as Jeremy touched on, it's about making sure you've got all those chocks in place. You've been working through the life cycle of your business, and you've got all your systems, processes, and procedures in place, so you know that you're not going to run into any problems as you expand or franchise or license your intellectual property. You're looking at the other markets that you want to expand into. What are the benefits of expanding, and the brand. You want to make sure, obviously, you've done your due diligence to see that the product that you are selling, that other business owners will want to use that in a different market. You've got to make sure that everything's in place, and there's some dangerous things that at this stage that you don't want to be, you want to be thinking about and making sure you overcome the attitude of, I can fix the problems later. Not a good way of going into an expansion phase. You want to make sure you've got everything in place. Things like, it doesn't matter if I don't have the systems in place, those sorts of things. it really does. You want to make sure you've got all that in place before you do expansion. There is some trust. You're going to have to get a team together through the expansion. So you make sure you've got some people there that you trust. And a dangerous attitude is that, I'm the business and I can do everything, and I don't trust anyone else to come into the business or to help me out. So make sure you consider all those sorts of options when you're thinking about expansion. So Jeremy, if you want to touch on or further on what to look out for when you're expanding your business.
Yeah, this is a really important issue that people miss is, whether it's the first time you've expanded or the 5th time or the 20th time, the same things need to be considered. And a lot of people miss some of these really important factors in their expansion plans. So the things to consider are, if you're leasing a new premises, what is that lease? How does it look like? How does it compare with your current lease? And we're going to talk about that in a bit more detail in a minute, but that's a really important thing. What are the terms? How does it marry up with your other leases? How do your terms of arrangement sit with your current business and your future plans? So what terms have you got with your clients? What arrangements have you got with your suppliers? And how does that sit with your current business and plans for the future? How will your employees interact? Craig and I, with our law firm, we have 2 different business premises. And one of the big things that we learned early on and that we're very big on is that the 2 teams in each office need to interact because they're all part of one team. And so you need to think about those things. Again, we'll go into a bit of detail about that in a minute. What systems do you have in place? One of the things that we often talk about with expansion is that when you expand, your problems and your lack of systems are really shown up in this phase. And that's one of the reasons why that we talk about the other 6 phases of the life cycle, getting all those systems in place, so that when you do expand, you don't have those problems, or you at least minimize those problems before you go expanding. So it's really important for you to consider really all the aspects of the business. As I said, if you've got 2 locations, 5 locations, 100 locations, if you've got problems, then they're going to expand and they're going to become worse and worse depending on the type of business and what you've actually got in place. So we're going to go into a bit of details about what to look out for with leasing a new premises, employees, and then we're going to get into mergers and acquisitions. So Craig, do you want to kick off with some considerations about what people should look at when they're leasing a new premises?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously if you're expanding into a new premise, you're going to be entering into a lease if you're not purchasing the property. So things you need to think about when you're entering into any new premises is, the rent and other payments that are due under the lease. Example, the outgoings. So, you need to know exactly what the dollar figure is, so you make sure you can afford it, obviously. Thinking about how it compares to your current premises, how the market rent, those sorts of things. So you want to look at the rent. The term is another important consideration with the lease. So that's the length of time you'll be leasing the premises for. So you want to make sure that it's right for you, that it's reasonable for your business and your expansion plans, that it's not too short, and obviously not too long. And you want to make it fit into your plans, your current premises. What's the term on that? How long is left on those terms? Those sorts of things. You want to look at the term. One of the big ones with any lease is looking at the permitted use. So this is what you're allowed or permitted to do or operate under in the lease. So you don't want to enter into a lease and then find out later that you actually can't do what you want to do. That would be a problem. So you need to think about those things and make sure that the permitted use is what suits your actual expansion and your business. Things like the obligation of maintenance of the property, how they relate to your current lease, and those sorts of things. You want to look at the obligations there with the maintenance and how long and what it's going to cost you over time, who's going to do what. In all leases, there's terms about default. If you don't make a payment or you breach the lease in some way, what are the obligations to you? What are the obligations at the end of the lease? Those sorts of things. There could be personal guarantees that you want to look at as well at that stage. Consider those. You're most likely going to have to sign one. There are ways around that. but talk to your team, your advisory team when you're entering into a lease, i.e. your lawyer, about negotiating the terms of the lease around various things, but including personal guarantees. What else do we want to look at? Obviously, you want to talk to the landlord, the real estate agent, those sorts of things. Make sure the condition of the premises is up to scratch. Think about what happens if the premises are damaged or destroyed. So, with anything, a lease is a pretty important document. You want to make sure you consider all of the obligations under that and make sure it suits not only your business but your expansion plans going forward. So that's the lease for a new premises. Jeremy, do you want to go over to bringing on some new employees as part of the expansion process?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. And this is a really important part, that if you're expanding your business, then you're really going to have to bring on new team members, new employees. You really, it depends on your situation, but you need to think about what you've got in place for those employees coming into your business. So, this is where getting all your systems and procedures right in phase 4, which is bringing on employees, really is crucial, and you need to make sure that you're getting on top of that. So, making sure that you've got the way that you engage your employees, how that they join your team, how that they're trained, having an onboarding process is so crucial in this phase of the life cycle, because you're going to be bringing on new teams. You need them to come in seamlessly. You need them to come in and do everything that needs to happen, and do it well and efficiently. And as I said before, you really need to make sure that you've got your systems and processes in place for them to join the team and to actually interact with your other team members. None of us these days want competing teams. Well, at least we hope you don't want that, because that's a terrible way to run a business. So you want them to work together, and you want them to be a team together. And the only way to do that is for them to actually interact. So I know, a lot of the big franchises, they bring their teams together on a semi-regular basis so that they can actually get to know each other and actually meet, because meeting people face to face is a great way to actually expand your business and to get your team working together. So getting the employees right and getting those systems and procedures right, well, you should already have that done from phase 4. If you haven't, now's the time to do it. Go back, revisit what we talk about in phase 4 of the life cycle, and make sure that you get those systems and procedures in place properly so that you can actually expand and don't fall into the common pitfalls which people talk about and happen when they expand and don't get their employees right. So, Craig, that's expansion. Do you want to talk about mergers and acquisitions now?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jeremy. So, your expansion of your business is not just limited to opening up a new premise or bringing on employees. A common method is where you expand your business by purchasing another business or merging two businesses together. So this is what's commonly referred to as mergers and acquisitions. So merging two businesses, and acquisitions as in acquiring or buying an existing business. There's obviously lots of examples of many great businesses using this strategy to expand. It's not for everyone. With anything, you need to consider it closely. It's probably an expensive exercise. You're going to be, particularly when you're acquiring a business, you obviously make sure you do all your due diligence on that business. And when you're merging a business, you're merging with someone else. So going back to trust and making sure you can operate with someone else when you're merging, there's a rough chance that that other business is going to have some people in it, and you're going to have to interact with those people. So you've got to make sure that you've considered that and you're happy with that strategy. As I said, merging is where two companies or businesses are coming together. There's a variety of ways that can be used. There's advantages and disadvantages of both strategies. When you're looking at it, the business doesn't necessarily have to be a competitor. Could be a totally different product that sort of sits in your sphere, or you want to go into a different market by merging with that business or acquiring that other business. So it's going to open up a whole new market, and with new customers, but obviously there's also going to be new competitors there as well. So you've got to consider that. And you just want to make sure that you're doing it for the right reasons and not using it as a quick fire strategy to expand your business, because, as I said, you are taking on quite a burden or another business. So you've got to make sure that you've looked at everything and you've done your due diligence, which is the most important part of this. This is where you need to get your team together again. This will be your accountant and your lawyer. You also potentially be talking to a business broker, talking to them about particular businesses that are for sale and doing your due diligence. You want to look at the lease that business that you might be buying or merging with has. Obviously the figures and those sorts of things, whereas where your accountant comes in about the historical data, about the financials, those sorts of things. You want to make sure it's actually making some money, and if it's not, that there's a strategy in place to do that. Looking at the staff, the history, all the agreements with the suppliers, if there's any contracts with purchases, those sorts of things. You want to look at all of those as part of the due diligence, because you're buying someone else's business or merging with it. And it'd be a good idea to have an agreement when you're merging to make sure that it covers off on everything. If it's going to be a new company that's set up, shareholders agreements and those sorts of things would be something else you'd want to consider. So it's a strategy for expanding your business. But as I said, you've got to make sure you do all your due diligence, get your team involved, and make sure you're not buying or merging with someone that has a whole heap of things in the second drawer that you're not aware of. So you want to do all your due diligence and get that in order. So that's merging and acquiring a new business. Jeremy, unless you've got something to add on mergers and acquisitions, if you want to kick on with purchasing some new equipment.
The only thing I'll add on to mergers and acquisitions is just the importance of what Craig went through then. There's so much that goes into a merger and acquisition. Whichever one you do, you need to make sure that you cover off on all of those points, because they are complicated transactions. Get legal advice. We have plenty of stories, plenty of examples of where people tried to do it themselves, or use someone who didn't know what they were talking about, and it ended in disaster. So make sure that you follow what Craig said, and get the workbook from today's episode if you are interested, and follow what we talk about there. So as Craig said, the next thing we wanted to talk about was equipment. So depending on the type of business that you have, you might want to buy new machinery or other assets that to basically expand your business. So this is for your building companies, your construction companies, your civil companies. They might buy new equipment. And this is a really important thing to get right, because a lot of people don't think of this as expansion, but it really is. It's like bringing on a new employee. It's like expanding into a new area. When you acquire assets or capital machinery, then you are expanding your business. And as I said, these are quite common that these occur, but there's a lot of things that you need to think about to make sure that you do it right. You have to get advice from your lawyer and your accountant to make sure that what you're doing is correct for your business. And you've got to decide on how you're going to buy it. So if you've got the cash to buy the equipment up front, great, pay the cash. A lot of people will buy it using an equipment lease or a chattel mortgage. So I'll talk about those two different ways. So an equipment lease or a chattel mortgage is a loan that the company will generally take out, and it would be to borrow money from a third party. It can be a bank, or it could be a non-bank lender. And you really need to read the documentation carefully. A lot of people just sign these agreements willy-nilly and don't really think about the consequences. Usually what you'll do is you'll give up a charge over that asset. So there's a thing called the Personal Property Securities Register in Australia. And basically that's where, if you own personal property, vehicles, equipment, lenders can take a charge over that asset, and basically that piece of equipment is charged with the payment of that asset. What does that mean? That means that if it's charged with the payment of that asset, then if you default, then they can come in and take that asset, sell it to recoup any of their losses. So you got to be really careful that you get that right. A lot of people think, I just have to sign the documents. There is often room to negotiate, so make sure that you investigate that if you can. If you're lucky enough to have cash, as I said before, you can purchase the piece of equipment up front and outright. Now, when you do this, it's really important that you properly get the right documentation in place. a lot of people think that they can just register the ownership of that piece of equipment, say if it's a vehicle or some piece of machinery that requires registration, and that means that they own it. That registration does not equal ownership. You need to have an agreement in place which actually shows who buys the piece of equipment, and then who buys it, and then who owns it. Registration can be in any other entity's name. Any entity can register a vehicle. So, for instance, my company could register or could buy my vehicle, and I could register that in my own name if I want to. It does not equal ownership. So this is where you really need to get advice and make sure it's done right, because from an asset protection point of view, you really want to make sure that what you're buying is correct. We've seen examples, haven't we, Craig, where people they've bought vehicles outright and they haven't got advice and they haven't searched the register, and they've ended up with an asset that was actually still owned by a different entity. We've seen that before, haven't we?
Yeah, absolutely. There's many dangers in buying equipment. Make sure you do all your checks and measures.
Yeah, search the PPSR register, search the registration register, make sure that you're checking everything correctly. So unless you want to add anything to that, we can move into the next topic, which is franchising.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we touched on expanding through moving into new premises, bringing on employees, buying equipment, or merging or buying an existing business. Another way of expanding your business into a new market, for instance, or expanding the actual product that you're selling, is by franchising. So this is where you have an agreement with someone. It could be written, implied, or verbal, and it's where you, as the franchisor, grants another person, and that's the franchisee, the right to carry on the business owned by you, using the system or marketing plan that you put together, and you have control over how that's operated by the franchisee. So what does all that mean? Essentially, it means that you allow another business to operate your business, but you want to maintain control as to how they operate the business, the name of the business, etc. The products that are sold, how they're all put together, those sorts of things. So the definition of a franchise and a franchise agreement is quite broad. It sort of encompasses quite a lot of things, and it's not something that you want to rush into. You've got to put together a number of documents that we'll go through shortly. And there's a lot of people that come into some trouble by sort of trying to get around the franchising legislation. So definitely not something you want to rush into and talk to the right people before you do it. Just because you don't call it a franchise doesn't necessarily mean that it won't be deemed as a franchise and be a franchise agreement, and therefore you'll have to comply with the legislation. So most people have heard of franchises operating around the world. There's obviously a number of famous franchises, McDonald's and those sorts of things. So it's a way of expanding your business into different locations through franchising. So, Jeremy, do you want to touch on the time to franchise? Because I think that's an important thing to think about. Not rushing into something and picking the time to franchise.
Yeah, absolutely, Craig. And this is a really important point. A lot of people, they see McDonald's, they see the Subways of the world, and they think, oh, great, I can franchise my business too. And really, it is a tough slog to franchise a business, and something that you need to spend a lot of time to get right. So when is the right time to franchise? Well, it's a great lawyer answer. It depends. It depends on when you've got your systems and your processes and your intellectual property all set up correctly. If you muck around with that and haven't got all that set up correctly, then it's not the right time to franchise. So you need to go and get some advice from either a lawyer or an accountant about whether or not it's time to franchise, because you need to have your intellectual property set up. You need to make sure that the brand that you're going to sell as part of this franchise is actually set up correctly, because if it's not, then it's not the right time to franchise. You can't franchise. And we've had examples of this where people have come to us to franchise their business and they haven't protected their intellectual property properly, intellectual property properly. Try saying that 3 times really quickly. And they've ended up spending years trying to protect their intellectual property that they should have done previously. And something we'll talk about in a minute is the manual, and we'll talk about what goes into a manual. But if you don't have a manual in place, then you can't franchise your business, because what your franchisees are buying is the intellectual property of how you operate your business. I haven't seen one, but I know we've had clients who have bought McDonald's franchises before, and they have a very long, in-depth manual that actually sets out everything that's to happen so that anyone can pick up this business and operate it day to day. Now, that doesn't mean that just anyone can operate a franchise. What it means is that the people who operate the day-to-day management of the franchise have a manual that tells them what to do. So you need to be really clear and intentional with your intellectual property, at your name, what trademarks you've registered, so what the person's actually buying from an intellectual property point of view, and also your intellectual property of how you operate your business, because that's really important. And as Craig said before, there are rules in Australia. There are rules and regulations about who can do franchises and what franchises can be in place and what has to be disclosed. And Craig's going to talk about the franchising code of conduct in a minute. Now, this doesn't apply to every country around the world. So, we're launching our UK book in the end of the month, and the UK doesn't have franchising laws. Neither does the US. Australia's quite unique in this vein, but you still need to make sure that you comply with the code of conduct, that you've set up a manual, that you've protected your intellectual property, because if you don't, then you fall foul of these laws. In Australia, they're there to protect the franchisees, but in other countries, you still need to have them in place. Because if you don't, then really you're going to be setting up your franchisees to fail. So Craig, do you want to talk about the code of conduct and how it applies in Australia?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's the franchising code of conduct, as Jeremy said. It's an Australian code, and it's a mandatory code that applies to all businesses that are franchises, and it sets out the minimum requirements that a franchisor and a franchisee must adhere to in the operation of the franchise business. So it's quite a lengthy document. You can read it at your leisure, but it basically deals with what must be disclosed by a franchisor before they enter into a franchise agreement with a franchisee. So it's an important code, and something, if you're in Australia and thinking about setting up a franchise, then you need to be familiar with the code of conduct. So what happens if you don't comply with the code? So there's a number of consequences to the franchisor. One would be that the franchisee may be able to use that failure to comply with the code to terminate the franchise agreement, which could be a bad thing for the franchisor. Secondly, there are some monetary fines that can be imposed on franchisors for failing to comply with the code. So it really just depends on the breach. The bigger the breach, the bigger the fine, I guess is the best way of putting it. If there's deliberate actions, damages, those sorts of things, and that'll be taken into account for the fines. So you don't want to fall foul of the franchising code of conduct. There are two, I've just said there, some major consequences. Now, Jeremy touched on why the franchising code of conduct, one of the reasons it's in place here in Australia, and it's around what is seen as a power imbalance between the franchisor and the franchisee. So what the code establishes is that the franchisor, the franchisee must act in good faith in all of their dealings between the parties. And normally that's not part of a commercial agreement. But as I said, because of the perceived power imbalance, they have in the code that everyone needs to act in good faith. So when you're going through the franchise agreement, obviously you're complying with the code. These sorts of documents, it's not a cheap or short process. There's many different things you need to look at. So this is where you will need to obtain advice from your lawyer on the legal compliance of the documents. Important to get it right, because if you don't, then there could be some major consequences, as I said. So you need to talk to the right consultants about your franchise agreement, making sure it complies with the code of conduct. So that's the code of conduct. As part of that, there is a disclosure statement, which is a very important document that Jeremy, you're going to speak about now.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. So, as Craig said, the disclosure statement is probably the most important document that comes out of the franchise code of conduct. And what it actually sets out is a bunch of information about the franchise. And it's a bunch of information that the Australian government, in their wisdom, have determined that franchisees need to know. And there's lots of information that goes into this document. I'm not going to go through every single thing. I'm just going to talk about some of the important things that need to be in there. The first thing is the intellectual property, as I said before. So you need to go into the intellectual property and show what actually intellectual property is that you own, and so that a franchisee can see that. Any payments that the franchisee needs to make is another really important thing. So in a franchise, there are many different fees that can be paid. There can be royalty fees, there can be equipment fees, there can be training fees, many different things. And in the franchise disclosure statement, you need to set all of those things up. Any commission payments or payments to third parties need to be included. So a disclosure statement should set out all of the payments that a franchisee may have to make to accountants, to lawyers, to all people that they might be dealing with. It's got to deal with, say, if there's a marketing budget, it's got to say how that marketing budget is to be operated, how it's to be audited, all that kind of information. There's got to be information about the cooling off period. So in Australia, part of the franchising code of conduct is that there's a cooling off period for a franchisee when they enter into a franchise, and you've got to set it out, what that cooling off period is and how it will apply. One of the things that I think is really important from a franchisee's point of view is details of existing franchisees. So you've got to set out all the details and contact information for all existing franchisees. Now, from here, we're talking about from a franchisor point of view, but from a franchisee point of view, this is really important so that they can speak to other franchisees. And as a franchisor, you need to be aware that they've got every right in the world, a prospective franchisee, to ring your old franchisees, the ones who are currently listed, and talk to them. So, if you don't treat them right, then they're probably going to find out, and that might cause you problems in actually getting franchisees on board. So hopefully that's no one who actually watches our show or listens to our podcast, Craig. But that's something that you need to be aware of. And the final thing that a lot of people miss is the financial information. So a disclosure statement's got to set out a bunch of financial information about the franchise, and also like franchise areas. And a good one will also set out what the prospective franchise information is for the franchisee. So look, that's a really short overview of a disclosure statement. It is involved. It does cost a lot of money to get it right, but do it, get it right, and what you'll find is that you get better franchisees. And that's what Craig's going to talk about now. He's going to talk about getting the best franchisees for your business. Craig.
Absolutely. So when you're moving into a franchise business, one of the most important parts of that is your franchisees. So for many franchisors, it can be tempting to allow any person that wants to pay the franchise fees and royalties to come on in and become a franchisee. The problem with that approach is the same as with any product that you might be selling or services that you're providing, that you're simply accepting all work that comes through the door. If you've got a bad franchisee in your franchise business, or a bad person in your business, the same applies. They're going to take away what makes your business, your franchise business, great. They're going to take up valuable time and operate the business and potentially cause damage to that business. So if you've got a franchisee out there that's not operating in accordance with the manual, for instance, that could be damaging your overall franchise business. So when you're entering into a franchise agreement with a franchisee, you're entering into a business relationship that could be from anywhere from 5 to 10 years long. So you need to be able to deal with this particular person for a lengthy period of time. So there might be some ups and downs throughout the relationship, but as long as you do your due diligence and make sure you're signing up a franchisee that's going to be there for the long haul, then you should hopefully eliminate any problems with some bad franchisees. So, we talked about McDonald's before. Their process of bringing on a franchisee is rigorous. before allowing and granting you the franchise. There's extensive training to ensure that you're right for the McDonald's brand and those sorts of things. So they look at your financials and all that jazz to make sure that you're going to be up to scratch and not going to have a failed franchise operation. So you obviously, when you're setting out, you're not going to be McDonald's straight away. But if you take on board those sorts of things and start with the beginning, with the end in mind, I should say, and making sure you've got the process in place to bring on franchisees, you're going to have the right mindset and the right strategy going forward, and hopefully you'll have a successful franchise business with a number of great franchisees operating around whatever jurisdiction you're in and expanding your business through those channels. So very important to look at your franchisees and just not take on any old Joe that comes through with a checkbook or money in the bank. All right, so that's franchisees. And then the last slide, Jeremy, that you're going to talk about, the disclosure statement obviously was very important at the beginning of the franchise, but the manual for the operation of the franchise would be the most important part. So do you want to talk about the manual?
Yeah, thanks, Craig. And I kind of started talking about this a bit earlier when we were talking about time to franchise. And the manual really is something that a lot of franchisees get wrong. Franchisors get wrong. And a lot of the time that is to their detriment long-term in their business. So the manual sets out what needs to happen in the business, how the business is operated, and basically should be able to be picked up by anyone and used in the business to operate the business as it is. Now, when I do a lot of franchises, and when we sit down with our prospective franchisor clients and ask whether they have a manual, the amount of times that I get a blank look is scary. You need to sit down and write a manual. Now, we talk about in phase 5, protecting intellectual property, about actually systemizing your business and getting systems in place. If you haven't done that by this stage, then you really need to sit down and get that sorted out so that you've got the systems and processes of how you do things in your business. One really important point to note about a manual is it's never set in stone. The systems and processes of how you operate your business might change from day to day. Probably the most important point that I need to get across today is that if you're going to set up a franchise, or even if you're just trying to systemize your business, don't pay someone else to write your manual. Let me say that again. Don't pay someone else to write your manual. They will charge you, and I've seen businesses that will charge $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 to write a manual. And what you get is, with all due respect to those businesses, a pile of rubbish. And the reason for that is that they're not in there every day operating your business. They have really good intentions. Let me be clear about that. They have really good intentions that they can help you and that they can do it. The problem is that every single client that I've seen who's had someone else write their manual has been a complete failure because it's not practical. It doesn't have the day-to-day operations of the business. If you want a franchise, you and your team need to write the manual. You need to use it in your business, and you need to make sure that it's practical and useful on a day-to-day basis. Otherwise, it goes and sits in the second drawer. And we all know, as Craig mentioned earlier, that anything that goes in the second drawer of your in anywhere in your life will never be seen again. It'll sit there, and you'll go to clean it out before Christmas, and you'll go, oh, what's this? And never actually use it. The great manuals are written by the people in the business. Never ever get someone else to write the manual for you. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking, well, where do I start? And we've put together a resource for our business owner clients that's a starting point. It's just a starting point. It's an index of the things that we see commonly need to go into an operations manual. If you're interested in doing that, go to businesslegallifecycle.com.au/operations-manual. We'll put that in the show notes, and this is show 147. So you'll, if you go to businesslegallifecycle.com.au/147, you'll find the show notes there. This is a comprehensive document. We've actually used it ourselves to put together our own manual for our business and made sure that it's practical and useful. And we've given it to clients time and time again, and we've updated it as a template. But we're not going to sit there and write it for you. You need to do it for yourself. So that's a bit of me on my soapbox. However, if you want to sell a franchise, and you can sell franchises you can make really good money from franchises, you need to spend the time and get your intellectual property, get what you're going to do in place early on. Because if you don't, that's when your franchisees will fail and it will end up being a complete disaster. So Craig, did you want to add anything onto that before we go into the last slide?
No, I don't think so. You've summarised it well. As I said, it's important, the manual, and encourage everyone to check out the index operations manual that will be available on the website and in the show notes. As Jeremy said, as a starting point to start thinking about what needs to go into your manual, and get onto it, and you can use it in your business anyway, as Jeremy said. So it's not just for the franchise. It's good to have in your business regardless going forward. So cool. All right. So that's it for franchising. The last topic we wanted to touch on that sort of goes hand in hand with franchises is licensing. So we see, and there's many examples of where business owners will attempt to set up a license agreement in an attempt to get around the requirements of the franchising code of conduct. So as we said, the code of conduct governs all franchises, and there's a number of minimum requirements that the franchisee needs to do. So to get around those, you may be tempted to license your intellectual property. So we're lawyers, there's a lot of risk involved. We give you that advice with the approach. As I said at the beginning, the franchise is a very broad definition, so it can encompass a number of different things and license agreements. So it's an area that you need to be very careful of and seek the right advice. So a license agreement is where a licensor, the owner of the intellectual property, allows another person, that's the licensee, to use their intellectual property in their business. So it's fine from a legal point of view, and these sorts of agreements are not illegal, just because you're maybe using it to get around the franchising code of conduct. That's a risk, but there are legitimate ways of using it. And the problems arise sometimes down the track, where you have a dispute potentially with the licensee, and then they might say something that potentially that should have been a franchise, and that's when it may come unstuck. But if you want to simply allow a business to use your intellectual property and not have the control over that intellectual property, then you can use a license agreement. So the distinction, or one of the main distinctions between licensing and franchising, that's the word, is control. So with a franchise, the franchisor maintains the control of the operation of the business, whereas in a license agreement, the licensor doesn't necessarily, or doesn't have that control anymore. So with anything, when we talk about these sorts of things, when there are risk, we strongly recommend that you obtain the right advice regarding this from your lawyer, to make sure that the agreement is correct, and you're not going to have some problems in the future. So there are some risk involved, but definitely a strategy that you can use to license your intellectual property for another business to use. So I think that's it, Jeremy, for expanding franchising. Do you have anything else you wanted to add or wrap up for today?
No, I think that's good. I think everyone hopefully got a lot of useful information out of this show. Expansion is a really, as you said, and we've said it a few times, there's many ways to be right, and it's a really important thing to make sure that you get right. As always, and as I mentioned before, we'll have show notes that are on our website, businesslegallifecycle.com.au/147 for our 147th show. If you are liking our content, please review us on iTunes, because that helps get that out there. And even subscribe on our YouTube channel if you like seeing Craig and I talk and going through our slides. We're going to be consistently putting up content on there as well. And if you subscribe to that page, you'll get the little bell that comes up in the corner that tells you that we've put up new content. So I think that's everything for today, Craig. One last thing, the show notes. The workbook. As always, we're continuing with the workbook, and that is in our show notes page as well. So do you have anything to add, Craig?
No, absolutely not. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We'll be back again for our legal updater show, I believe, later on this week. So if you're interested in that, we go through some legal updates around the world over the last month or so. So please join us then. Thanks very much for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.
See you then.